Congratulations on making it to the final week of Pol 3 IPC. This week, we're going to end on a more empowering note, exploring the global climate change movement. Now, as we've seen through the semester, global climate politics incorporates many different actors contesting in overlapping systems of power, in which power relationships are often vastly unequal. But yet much of the everyday advice given to people for sustainable living is about small-scale, simple things like changing light bulbs or recycling bottles, which is either a horrible misreading of international power dynamics or it's a deliberate attempt to restrict environmentalism to actions that don't threaten corporate power. Overemphasizing individual action shames people for their everyday activities, things that we can't avoid doing because of the fossil fuel dependent economy that we're inevitably nested within. Environmental purity contests and circular firing squads are not the answer to addressing such complex systemic problems that are associated with climate change and its impacts. And what's more, it's politically naive. Individual action lacks political leverage over transnational systems of power. At the international level, the Paris Agreement will be the frame for global climate governance for the coming decades. However, as we've seen, there's a large gap between the emissions reduction pledges that governments have made so far and the level of reductions necessary to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius stabilisation target. Quite simply, governments haven't proven themselves to be up to the task of doing this on their own without significant pressure from below. So if we're going to take the advice of climate justice activist Mary Anise Hegler to stop obsessing over our environmental sins and get organised, what might that collective mobilisation look like? The diverse global climate change movement is channeling individual action into this collective mobilisation as a politically potent force of transnational scale. So this is where individual agency meets international climate politics through the emergent power of transnational networks. So to flesh all this out through this video, I'm going to start by defining social movements, and then I'll talk about some of the key social movement characteristics, including mobilizing grievances and political context, movement participation and movement internal dynamics, as well as the goals, strategy and tactics of social movement actors. I'll then look at some climate movement case studies before finishing up talking about your role in international climate politics. Social movements are defined as collective challenges to the power of the state and other dominant systems of power by people with common purposes and solidarity in sustained interaction over time through repertoires of protest and innovations of practice. Now, there's a lot going on in that definition, so let's deconstruct. Social movements are explicitly political and they directly challenge existing power structures. So this is what distinguishes them from other movements and other forms of collective activity. They tend to be horizontally networked. So common purpose and solidarity link people together in a social movement in the absence of a more formal organisational structure across the movement. Collective action through mobilising large numbers of people is how you get political leverage in relation to structures of power. And on repertoires of protest and innovations of practice, they're constantly evolving new goals, new strategies and new tactics through the interactions of movement members and in response to the interactions of the movement with state power. So to cite Aidan Ricketts, who's author of The Activist Handbook, social movements effectively fill the power gap between the individual and the state by harnessing the leverage of collective agency. Social movements are the political mobilisation tool of social justice struggles, of people who are on the receiving end of coercive power. And the global climate movement is very much part of this social movement family tree. It's large and it's truly global, which is why it has a political impact within the broader ecosystem of international climate politics. Now, the academic literature on social movements is pretty big, it's vast. However, it is possible from this literature to identify a series of core elements that characterise social movements. I like the summary of the literature by Remy Cross and David Snow from their entry into the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Sociology, which groups the literature around some core elements, and these are mobilising grievances, contextual conditions, the diversity of participants, and the organising dynamics of the movement. So this chapter is available on LMS. I encourage you to check it out. All social movements start from a set of mobilising grievances, which are the underlying social, economic, political and environmental problems that underpin movement formation and provide the motivation for collective action. Scholars from the relative deprivation theory branch of the social movement family tree argue that movement participation is driven by deprivation and shared grievances in relation to existing power structures. So from this perspective, the potential for collective political action is related to the scope and intensity of these shared grievances across a society. At first glance, the mobilising grievances for the climate movement seem obvious. However, this is more complicated than it might first appear. As we've seen, different people experience climate change impacts in different ways, depending on their circumstances and depending on where they are. In general, any social injustice that's made worse by climate change is likely to be a mobilising grievance for collective action in the climate movement. But there are communities that might lose from climate mitigation policies as well. So think of coal mining communities, for example. So people in these places might be less likely to mobilise around climate vulnerability and social justice issues. This shows that the kind of large-scale discontinuity in the political structure and social fabric that I've talked about previously in this subject doesn't necessarily lead directly to participation in the climate movement. So if we look at mass society theory, which is another branch of the social movement family tree, this was based on analysis of the rise of fascism during the 1920s and 30s. And it warns that our historic moment could also provide an opportunity for the mass mobilisation of people who are not strongly connected to the old order, who might be atomised and not strongly socially anchored, but who reject the social justice foundations of the climate movement and the need for a post-carbon transition. So same grievance pressures, different pathway of political action. And here you can see the contours of the far right as it's starting to manifest internationally. You can see this illustrated in the rise of Trumpism in the US, the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil, and in other far right leaders around the world, as well as in the rising popularity of conspiracy theories like QAnon and others. The people in this movement are responding to the same historic discontinuity that I described in week 2, and have some of the same socioeconomic grievances, but they've got radically different assumptions about the causes of this rupture and radically different visions about where this wave of change should go. And you're more likely to see climate denial commingling with this movement rather than any substantive concern for climate change as a problem. There's a strong strand of libertarian individualism in this movement. And through commitment to the idea of personal liberty, it rejects the idea of complex interdependence. It's also hyper-nationalist and often racist and violent in its orientation, and it rejects international cooperation and is especially hostile to the Paris Agreement. That's a really totemic hostility. So climate justice issues from this perspective are seen as political correctness and a manifestation of woke politics. Now, while I reject the core assumptions underpinning these positions as not based in ecological reality, and the embedded bigotry I find deeply toxic, I think it's extremely important that we understand the far-right mobilisation as a political reaction that's directly connected to the discontinuities of our time, and it's part of the broader social ecosystem of global climate politics. So we can't ignore it, and we do need to understand it. So we have to ask then, why does the climate movement emerge as a response to the conditions of this historic discontinuity? The specific contextual conditions that are required for social movement mobilisation is about the why here, why now question. And this is a question that's asked by political opportunity theorists in the social movement literature. The argument here is essentially that the stars align, that specific constellations of circumstances converge to open a window of political opportunity for social movement action. Now, it's not that social movements are pointless outside of an open window of political opportunity. It's that there are specific moments when movements that have been bubbling away at the grassroots for a long time explode to life and become highly popular and influential. There are a few different variables that are relevant to the windows of political opportunity. The relative openness of political systems and the existence of free spaces for political action are really important. So free spaces are where dissenting views can be expressed and spread. Now, democratic countries tend to be more favourable in terms of free spaces than authoritarian countries for seemingly obvious reasons, but they're not perfect, and there are pressures attempting to close these free spaces. So what kind of factors compromise free spaces in relation to climate activism? This could include the criminalisation of environmental protest and the defunding of government-funded environmental organisations. And conservative governments seem to be particularly enamoured with this strategy. We can also point to the coercive power of state institutions, including police and espionage agencies. In some countries, this includes direct violence from police and from militaries, as well as the infiltration of environmental groups with informants for state intelligence agencies and the police. Now, this has all been documented in a 2019 report by the NGO Global Witness, which found that in 2018, 164 environmental activists around the world were murdered, with many more who were silenced through violent attacks, arrests, death threats, and lawsuits. The graph on the right here breaks down where most of these murders took place, along with the industrial sectors that the murdered activists were protesting against. And this is a really chilling illustration of the extractive nature of the international economy, and more importantly, the power interests that emerge from it, particularly in developing countries. External forces can also play a role in the opening and closing of windows of political opportunity. So it could be international economic shocks and variations in levels of employment that come from these shocks. It could be the demonstration effect of protests in other countries that spread internationally, a la the Arab Spring or the Occupy movement or Black Lives Matter. Or it could be climate change impacts themselves, like the summer of bushfires we had last year, for example, or the global pandemic, or a change in the balance of politics. More importantly, it's about all of these forces of change coalesce that helps to open and close windows for effective political action. The global climate movement is a social movement in every sense, and it's also extremely diverse, both in terms of the demographics of its participants and the types of allied organisations involved, including NGOs, activist organisations and community groups. The climate movement encompasses actors from across the ideological spectrum, including grassroots groups and professional organisations spanning the global north, global south divide. At its best, this movement is multi-ethnic, intergenerational, and tied in with other social justice issues. However, some of the leading players in the movement have also been accused of being very middle class and white, particularly in Western countries, to the exclusion of some of its more diverse members. That's why intersectional environmentalism and the difficult climate justice work that we explored in previous weeks is a key point of discussion across the climate movement. We've established that not everyone who could be a part of the global climate movement ends up participating, even where individuals may be strongly sympathetic with the movement. In the social movement literature, this is referred to as biographical availability, and it relates to who has the capacity to participate in political action. Some people in some places just can't because they're too busy trying to survive, or because they're at risk of persecution. This can create a selection bias on the people who participate actively in social movements, and this bias could turn off potential participants from getting involved if the movement membership is not welcoming. Diverse participation requires conscious management to ensure that all movement participants are represented in decision-making over messaging, strategy and tactics, as well as how the organisations within the movement interact with each other internally and across the movement. Now, this is not always the case in mass social movements, where the economic and racial divisions of the broader society end up being perpetuated within the movement itself. Questions of social movement participation animate the scholarship of new social movement theorists, who have an interest in who participates, how they participate, and why. The why of participation is also linked to psychological factors. So some people join social movements that affirm their existing identities. It's pretty obvious that a sense of identification with the climate movement is a strong determinant of active participation. There's also a sense of collective identity that can come with sustained movement participation. Also, emotional connections to people, to places, ideas and things can be an important foundation of climate movement participation. So recall the creative drawing activity we did in week 2 as an illustration of this and as an illustration of the power of emotional connection and emotional relationships in the formation of power. So looking back on our work from the last few weeks of Pol 3 IPC, we can see that for many people involved in climate justice activism, their participation in the climate movement is a survival necessity in their resistance against discrimination and violence. So for them, movement participation isn't a choice. And the connections they make with allies across the climate movement gives them greater political leverage in their existential struggles. So for allies of the people in this position, understanding these high stakes and showing solidarity is an important motivation for participation as well. Movement participation is political praxis, or to put it another way, it's politics in action. Discussion and debate within movement organisations and between different actors across the movement ends up being a unifying force. The practice of grappling with how issues of common interest are framed and interpreted is an important part of the ritual of movement action. This process of relationship is part of the glue that holds the movement together, even when there's great disagreement between actors about how those common interests should be framed and interpreted. And this is something we see across many different social movements. The process of doing politics is just as important as the outcomes. If we look at social movements as whole entities, we can see they tend to be decentralised and non-hierarchical, which sets them apart from more formal political organisations. There's no single body that represents the movement. So think of the global climate movement rather as an umbrella for a range of different actors, from individuals to activist groups to professional environmental NGOs. Movement actions across the movement, they're negotiated and organised through horizontal networks. And they're organised at different levels of scale, from coordinated global actions to local activities that are run by a few people. And decentralised non-hierarchy is also important to the climate movement to protect against retaliation from governments or from co-optation by vested interests. So remember, this is political activity, and there's always a counter-force, a resistance, a counter-revolution from systems of power that are trying to decrease the effectiveness of the climate movement. However, there's a drawback to this. So decentralisation and diversity means that movement-wide collective action requires significant negotiation and compromise. There's usually significant disagreement between movement actors on goals, strategy and tactics, even while collectively they're moving more or less in the same direction. And this negotiation takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. A useful way to think about different actors within the climate movement is to examine the extent to which they're either professional or participatory organisations. So professional orgs tend to have a bureaucratic structure. So think of NGOs like Greenpeace or the Worldwide Fund for Nature or the Sierra Club. All of these fit this category. Participatory organisations, on the other hand, are more democratic in how they're constructed, with either horizontal organisational structure or they function as a looser, decentralised network. So think of examples like Friends of the Earth or Extinction Rebellion. There's a convergence of interests and complementarity of strategies between professional and participatory organisations within the climate movement. However, there's also competition and divergence between actors, and the operational logics of their organisational structure plays a role in shaping these diverging interests. How different actors within the social movement are organised shapes their goals, as well as shaping how they're able to obtain and deploy finances, how they can draw on skilled people and information, and how they generally mobilise their available resources for political action. So in the social movement literature, this is the terrain of resource mobilisation theory. So to give an illustrative example, bureaucratic professional organisations need to devote a lot of effort to media exposure and fundraising to finance the bureaucracies that they've built up to do their work. However, that structure also gives them the capacity to engage with governments and engage with businesses in a way that more loosely structured participatory actors can't. On the other hand, participatory organisations are more agile and they can mobilise more quickly for on-the-ground political actions. Both play an important role within the broader social ecosystem of the climate movement. The climate movement itself doesn't have goals, strategy and tactics. It's the actors within the movement that develop these. The movement is an emergent outcome of the convergence of collective activities of the movement actors around their consensus issues. The goals of actors within the global climate movement usually fall into 4 different camps, and you can see these illustrated here on the right. So this graphic comes from the work of Australian political scientist John Dryzek on environmental discourses. So let's untangle this graphic. The horizontal axis is about the pace and scale of change. So it goes from slow and incremental reform on the one hand to fast-paced radical system change on the other. The vertical axis is about ambition and creativity of response. So from prosaic strategies working with established ways of doing things to more imaginative innovations that develop new ways of doing things. The graphic on the left illustrates where different environmental discourses might fit within these 4 broad camps. We've talked about all of these either explicitly or implicitly all through the semester. Most national government climate policies tend to sit within the solving problems box, reflecting that government policy is constrained by the bureaucratic logic of government institutions, as we touched on in week 6. This is not generally a discourse that's espoused by people in the climate movement itself. UN agencies and the UNFCCC treaty regime sits in the sustainability quadrant. We examine sustainable development and ecological modernisation in our look at global climate economics in week 4, and which we see the way through post-carbon transition is the greening of capitalism. In the limits and deniers quadrant, we might find doomsday prepper types who accept the ecological limitations of the Earth but don't think that there's much we can do about the climate catastrophe, or they reject the climate catastrophe outright. Finally, in the green radicalism box, you'll find movement actors who see radical societal transformation as the only way to address climate change, and are developing new political, social, material and economic innovations to build a new post-carbon society. So the moral of this story is that every actor within a social movement, within the global climate movement, is working towards a set of goals that are informed by one of these environmental discourses. The goals of social movement actors tell us what they aim to accomplish, and on reflection, whether those goals were ultimately successful on their own terms. Social movements as a whole tend to coalesce around a broad common issue. In the case of the global climate movement, its constituent actors agree that climate change is an existential threat and that climate mitigation and adaptation strategies are urgently required to address this threat. However, beneath that broad consensus, movement actors have their own goals and objectives based on the environmental discourses that shape their thinking. From goals, we narrow down to strategies and tactics. So strategies are long-term, large-scale plans that are designed to reach the goals that any movement actor has. Tactics, by contrast, are short-term, they're smaller-scale specific actions. They're particular acts which put strategies into effect. So here I'm drawing on the work of Aric McBay from the book Deep Green Resistance, which is where this graphic comes from. The graphic illustrates different acts of omission and commission that you'd see reflected in the strategies and tactics of different climate movement actors. As I mentioned earlier, how a social movement is organised and how movement actors coordinate with each other is also important here. Because social movement actors range from individuals to groups to large bureaucracies, how those actors organise themselves and how they coordinate their interactions can determine the strategies and tactics that might be viable to achieve their goals. We've already met some of the constituent members of the global climate movement in our previous week's work on climate displacement, climate justice and First Nations peoples. Here though, I'd like to briefly examine some other actors within the movement. Even though they all share broadly similar core objectives around climate mitigation and adaptation, they nonetheless exhibit some contrast in goals, strategy and tactics, and it's these contrasts that I'd like you to think hard about. Now, the case studies I'm about to briefly go into, this is not an exhaustive list of movement actors, and it does have a Western selection bias because these are movement actors which I'm more familiar with. However, this analytical framework we've developed here can be applied to climate movement actors from anywhere in the world. So I encourage you to apply this framework to critically examine the goals, strategy and tactics of any climate movement actors you come across, along with their grievances, context, participant profile and internal dynamics, because a lot of this is likely to be locally specific and it'll tell you a lot about local context. Let's start with the school strike for climate movement, which was sparked by Greta Thunberg in 2018 when she started spending her school days picketing the Swedish Parliament, holding a sign that said "School Strike for Climate." Thunberg's solo protest got traction. It went viral on social media and it ended up mushrooming into a global youth movement that has extraordinary energy. School Strike for Climate is not a professional body. It's more of a transnational coalition that spans the climate movement. Its goals are to pressure governments to reject new fossil fuel projects and transition the economy to 100% renewables, which is underpinned by an approach of just transition. So this is reflective of the sustainability discourse. Its strategy is to mobilise the voices of young people who've been, to this point, poorly represented in climate decision making, and particularly at an international level. Their tactics centre on the mobilisation of simultaneous student strikes around the world to lobby power, protest policy inaction and raise awareness. I personally found the school climate strikes of 2018 and 2019 in Melbourne to be extraordinary. They brought a whole new different energy to the climate movement from previous mass climate protests that I'd been a part of here. Our second case study is Extinction Rebellion, which is another decentralised global movement which emerged from the UK also in 2018. Now, their core contention is that climate change is the leading edge of a mass extinction event that's an existential threat to humans and an existential threat to all life, hence justifying civil disobedience and direct action. Like School Strike for Climate, XR is not a professional organisation. It's a decentralised transnational movement of independent actors working within a framework of core principles. It comes out of the limits and the green radicalism discourses, and its goals include pressuring governments to declare a climate emergency and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025, as well as establishing citizens' climate assemblies to inform government decision-making on climate and ecological justice. Their core strategy involves using non-violent direct action and civil disobedience, which can be employed tactically by independent local groups operating under the XR banner. Let's look now at a bureaucratically structured professional body within the climate movement. The Climate Reality Project, spearheaded by former US Vice President Al Gore. So this body emerged in the wake of Al Gore's Oscar-winning documentary from 2006, An Inconvenient Truth, and its follow-up film, An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power. Emerging from the problem-solving and the sustainability discourses, the goal of the Climate Reality Project is to accelerate government action at all levels on climate mitigation and adaptation through a strategy of training individuals to pull the levers of power, as they put it on their website, pull the levers of power within government and within business bureaucracies. So it's an insider strategy. Tactically, they provide training modules in over 170 countries, and they plug in their graduates into a global network to maximise their political leverage. So this is a bureaucratic professional body that's plugged into the corridors of power. And this is what you'd expect from someone like Al Gore. He's been vice president, he's held high office for a long time, and he's highly connected across government and business sectors. So in setting this up, he's been able to leverage that experience and those connections. As a final case study, I want to focus on La Via Campesina, an international peasants' movement that was founded in Belgium in 1993, which works for food sovereignty, peasants' rights and agrarian reform, along with First Nations land rights and the material politics of agroecological transitions. Environmental and climate justice is a core element of this work. So La Via Campesina is explicitly radical and anti-capitalist, and it's strongly rooted in green radicalism as an environmental discourse. Strategically, it coordinates peasant organisations of small and middle-scale producers, agricultural workers, rural women, and also Indigenous communities in Asia, Africa, the Americas and Europe. Its tactical actions are coordinated locally on the ground by local actors based on specific local issues and circumstances. In terms of organisational structure, La Via Campesina is a hybrid. It incorporates a central bureaucratic hub that facilitates support, resource and knowledge exchange, and publicity for local actors that are affiliated with it. I hope that you found the subject material across the semester in Pol 3 IPC to be intellectually stimulating and emotionally challenging, and importantly given you some inspiration to make your own constructive contribution. It is my conscious intention that you come away from this subject understanding that global climate politics is not a spectator sport, that you come away wanting to take action, wanting to do something constructive with what you've learned. Of course, what you decide to do is up to you. Remember though that there are many fellow travellers out there. There's many people putting theory into practice, doing good work in the climate mitigation and adaptation space, and accruing the hard-won lessons that people have learned on this journey for decades now. And whether that's in government, in the business sector, in the community. And remember that you have a network of friends, including myself here at the university, many people in the uni community who you can continue to draw on for help in your own quest, even after you graduate. So I'm still in touch with a number of former Pol 3 IPC students who are doing great things in the professional world. My challenge to you as we wind up our journey together in international politics of climate change is this. Think about the kind of life that you want to lead, the kind of society that you want to live in light of the climate and environmental challenges that we're facing globally. Think about what it means to be a constructive player in Anthropocene climate politics and what it would mean to try and create the kind of life that you want. Think about how you might go about this in ways that benefit everyone and not just yourself. And once you've done all this thinking, get out there and make it happen. On that note, I want to thank you deeply for coming with me on this journey through the international politics of climate change, and I wish you nothing but the best as you keep that journey rolling.